السيناتور اسمه كريس ميرفي، ده بيتكلم عن المعونة لمصر، المعونة العسكرية لمصر، وبيتكلم باختصار كده يعني، واتكلم عن على اللي حصل في زامبيا، يعني حتى معلوماته ما هياش دقيقة 100% يعني، بس اتكلم عن اللي حصل في زامبيا، اتكلم عن الصحفي بتاع ما تصدقش اللي اتحبس علشان خاطر او اتقبض عليه علشان خاطر اتكلم عن اللي حصل في زامبيا، وان هو فضح الفساد اللي حصل في زامبيا. انا عايز اغطيه كده باختصار. الراجل بيقول ان احنا المعونة اللي احنا بنديها لمصر مش اول مره ان هي حاجه تتعلق منها، وكل مره اصلا مع ان توصيات الكونجرس بتبقى بتقول ان احنا نعلق المعونه، ومع ذلك الاداره او يعني الجزء التنفيذي، الرئيس نفسه او الرئاسه يعني، بيفرجوا عن المعونه ده. وده اللي حصل دلوقتي يعني. هو بيتكلم في ان في 85 مليون، عشان انتوا هتسمعوا الخبر كل واحد هيعرض الخبر من وجهه نظره، فانا حابب اقول لكم الخبر كامل. الخبر ان في 85 مليون في 85 مليون دولار دول هيفضلوا محتجزين يعني. اللي عايز يتكلم هيقول بس كده ان 85 مليون دولار دول موقوفين او معلقين من المعونه. وهو قال ان ال 85 مليون دولار دول المفروض ان هم مرتبطين بالافراج عن اسماء معينه، ناس مساجين اكيد طبعا على عبد الفتاح. الباقي بقى 240 او 250 مليون هم دول اللي افرج عنهم، وهم دول، وهو ده برضو اللي هيبقى عايز يقول الخبر بالطريقه دي، هيقول ال 250 مليون دولار اللي افرج عنهم من غير ما يجيب سيره ال 85 مليون، او يقول ال 85 مليون من غير ما يجيب سيره ال 250 مليون. ده كان معلق علشان المفروض يبقى في تحسن في حاله حقوق الانسان في مصر، وطبعا ده كده كده ما حصلش ولا حاجه. افرجوا عن ال 240 وحجزوا 85 مليون دولار دول المحجوزين لغايه دلوقتي يعني. المهم في الكلام اللي يهمنا في الموضوع ده حاجتين. الحاجه الاولى ان دي مش حاجه جديده، دي كل مره بتحصل يعني، كل سنه تقريبا بيحصل الكلام ده، مش ايام السيسي بس، من ايام مبارك كمان وكان بيحصل الكلام ده. يقول لك هنعلق المعونه وبعدين في الاخر يفرجوا عنها. خلي بالكم برضه اربطوا الافراج عن ال 250 او 240 مليون دولار، هو ده اللي يهمنا بالكلام اللي قلته الاسبوع اللي فات عن النجم الساطع. هو احنا المؤشر بالنسبه لي يعني، او مؤشر مهم قوي بالنسبه لي، النجم الساطع. فهي انا شايف ان الافراج عن ال 240 مليون دولار دول هو ده اللي يهمنا. ان هم امريكا ما هم لغايه دلوقتي ما هماش شاغلين بالهم قوي باللي بيحصل في مصر خالص يعني، حتى لدرجه ان هو ما جابش سيره ان في حمله. يعني انت بتتكلم عن مصر، اهم حدث دلوقتي داخلي جوه مصر الانتخابات، ما حدش جاب سيره ولا الانتخابات ولا حد جاب سيره ان في مرشح حقيقي وان في ضغوط بتحصل عليه. ما حدش يتكلم خالص في الكلام ده يعني. انما الحاجه الثانيه بقى المهمه اللي هو قالها، ان هو قال انتوا يعني الاداره دايما بتقول او الرئاسه بتقول ان ده علشان اعتبارات الامن القومي الامريكي، فاحنا ملتزمين ان احنا نديهم الفلوس دي كل سنه. وقال حاجه مهمه، قال ان هو كده السيسي هو مصلحته كمصلحته هو الشخصيه يعني، كمصلحه البلد او ادارته هو الشخصيه، ان هو يعمل الكلام ده، ان هو يحافظ على الاستقرار في غزه، ويحافظ على الاستقرار على حدود اسرائيل، وان هو مصلحته ان هو يحافظ على الملاحه في قناه السويس. فانتوا بتدوا له فلوس ليه يا جماعه؟ يمكن الفلوس دي كانت مبرره في الثمانينات، انما دلوقتي انتوا بتدوا له فلوس ليه يعني؟ ودي طبعا دي حاجه مهمه، عشان انا اظن يعني الفتره اللي جايه هنسمع كلام كتير فينا، ما انا مش شايف ان هو حاجه، ان اللي حصل ديت حاجه مبشره خالص يعني بالنسبه لملف مصر جوه الاداره الامريكيه.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I want to paint a picture for you just for a moment. It takes place on a tarmac in the Zambian capital of Lusaka, just a few weeks ago, in fact. A small private jet arrives from Egypt. It lands there hoping to go unnoticed because of what's on board that jet. But it does get noticed by Zambian authorities. They board the plane and they find inside a cargo that sounds like something out of a James Bond movie. On board that plane is $5.7 million in U.S. currency, 602 bars of gold, 5 pistols, and 126 rounds of ammunition. To make the story even more bizarre, it turns out that the gold was not actually real. It was fake bars of gold. But the currency is real, the ammunition is real, but the gold's fake. Zambia arrests 12 people, 6 of whom are Egyptian citizens. And immediately, as you can imagine, speculation begins about what is exactly going on. Now, that's an interesting story, right? But the reason I tell you the story isn't because of what happened in Zambia. It's because of what happened next in Cairo. So 6 of these individuals were Egyptian citizens. The plane came from Egypt. And so, of course, journalists in Cairo start to do some digging. A fact-checking platform named Motsaddash, now I'm probably butchering the pronunciation, but it's Arabic roughly for don't believe it. They report on the alleged involvement of former Egyptian security officials in the incident. But this kind of truth-telling is just not allowed in Egypt today. Egypt is a closed society. It's a dictatorship in which political dissent is crushed. The free press is essentially non-existent. And as a consequence, top officials are allowed to enrich themselves without any accountability. So what happened to the journalists at Motsaddash is interesting, but it's frankly par for the course in Egypt. Here's what happened. In response for doing this reporting, Egyptian security officials went straight to the home of the journalist. They raided his home. They forced him to log on to his computer as they were there, and they forced him to delete the Facebook posts about the outlets, about the issue at hand. Egypt just wanted this story to disappear, and they were willing to do whatever it took to make this happen. Now, we may never know the full story of what happened in that airport, what was going on with that plane. But what we do know is that the Egyptian government's reaction is part of a completely predictable pattern to muzzle and silence the truth tellers by force. Beyond these attacks on Motsaddash, 2 other journalists covering the episode were also detained immediately after without charge. One of the last remaining independent media outlets in Cairo, Mada Masr, has repeatedly been refused a legal license to operate. Websites that report on this kind of activity of Egyptian officials, they're shut down as soon as they appear. Activists are regularly jailed for spreading false news about human rights violations. Over and over again, the government's playbook is just the same. Shut down voices that are critical of the government. Throw in jail people who don't comply. Now, around this same time last year, I came down to the Senate floor to make a very similar speech to talk about an annual decision that the administration has to make with regard to our aid to Egypt. And the decision is pretty straightforward. Now, Congress, in a bipartisan way, cares about this campaign of brutal repression against the press and political dissent in Egypt. That's why our annual appropriations bill limits the amount of money the administration can send to Egypt, depending on the government's human rights record. Specifically this year, Congress has said that $320 million of the aid we send, which is roughly about a quarter of the aid, can't go to Egypt unless the administration certifies that Egypt has made real progress on these questions of political climate, 85 million of which is tied to the release of specific political prisoners, and the remaining 235 million on broader improvements on questions of human rights and democracy. Now, I just want to be honest with you. In the past, the Bush administration, the Obama administration, the Trump administration, they just routinely waived these conditions and sent the full amount with any real progress. They said it was about American national security without any actual evaluation as to what the consequence of withholding money would be to our national security. But to the Biden administration's credit, over the past 2 years, they have withheld a portion of Egypt's military aid because of these human rights violations. And last night, as I was writing this speech, the administration rightly decided to withhold that first tranche, $85 million, tied to the release of political prisoners, because there's just no question there has not been enough progress. Why do we know that? Because, well, Egypt released and has released more than 1,600 political prisoners since early 2022. That's good news. During that same time, they have jailed 5,000 more. So for every political prisoner that Egypt releases, 3 more are jailed. That's one step forward and 3 steps back. That's not the kind of clear and consistent progress in releasing political prisoners that the law requires. The administration was right to withhold the $85 million. But what about the remaining $235 million? I'd argue that the answer is just as simple. The Biden administration needs to hold the line, as evidenced by the response to the fake gold-filled plane. Political repression is getting worse, not better, in Egypt. Now, every year there are some people who argue that even though Egypt really hasn't made any progress on human rights, they should get the money anyway in the name of national security. That if we dare to withhold even a small portion of that money, Egypt is going to stop cooperating with us and they're going to run to Russia or China instead. But as we have seen in the last 2 years, when the administration did withhold a portion of the $1.3 billion, the sky did not fall. Yeah, I will admit to you, our diplomats in Cairo probably had some very tough conversations, and the Egyptians certainly have made life a little bit more difficult for our diplomats around the edges, but the core security relationship remains intact. Why is that? It's because the things that we want Egypt to do that are good for our national security, like working to keep the situation in Gaza as stable as possible through its relationship with Hamas, ensuring the free flow of commerce and U.S. warships through the Suez Canal, keeping counterterrorism operations going in the Sinai. President Sisi does all of those things because it's in Egypt's independent national security interest to do so, not because we pay them to do it. Maybe when we started giving them $1 billion in aid back in the 1980s, Egypt, in fact, complied with our national security requests because of that monetary relationship. But today, Egypt engages in those activities because they have an independent reason to do so. In fact, it's telling that even though the Egyptians continue to receive $1 billion per year in military aid, even with that money, they are reportedly and have been reportedly seeking to do deals with the Russians and the Chinese. Earlier this year, reporting on leaked documents revealed that Egypt had made a secret deal to provide Russia in the middle of the Ukraine war with 40,000 rockets. Now, only after a flurry of high-level diplomatic interventions did the Egyptians change course. And despite a reported request in March of this year from Secretary Austin for Egypt to help Ukraine, the Egyptians have not yet done so. And so the question is this the behavior of a country that we call a key security partner? And let me be clear. This decision that the administration is going to make, it matters far beyond Egypt. If we say human rights and democracy matters to America, then it has to matter in more than words. When we cut corners and we fail to hold our partners accountable for human rights abuses, people notice. Now, I'm not naive. I know that the question of whether we withhold a couple $100 million of security assistance from President Sisi is not going to convince him to end his brutal campaign of political repression. But when we walk the walk, not just talk the talk on human rights, another audience hears us. Activists, the people who are doing this work on the streets in places like Cairo, those that are fighting for democracy and human rights in countries with little of either, they gather courage from knowing that the United States is on their side. And it is those forces, those organic domestic forces, that truly make change. But when we keep on doing business, as usual, with Saudi Arabia or Tunisia or Egypt, despite their behavior, we send a signal to democracy activists that we aren't serious, that we don't have their back. And so I am glad for the administration's decision last night to withhold a part of the funding that Congress has required to be withheld unless we see significant progress on human rights. And my belief is that there is only one decision to be made on the remaining dollars, because the record is clear. Egypt continues to help us on national security priorities where our interests align. And there's good reason to continue a security relationship with Cairo to preserve those interests. In other areas, like the war in Ukraine, Egypt has not been a helpful partner. And we need to be clear-eyed about our security relationship with Egypt and also about Egypt's human rights record. The decision that the administration will make this week about holding the Egyptians accountable for progress on human rights, it is critical to American credibility. And for that reason, I would urge the administration to finish the job and withhold the full $320 million as required by the FY22 Appropriations Act until Egypt's human rights and democracy record improves. I yield the floor.